There's a financial system so powerful that it decides which governments survive and which collapse. It's not elected. It doesn't answer to voters. Right now, it holds more power over your country's future than your own leaders do. Every 72 hours, this system moves enough money to buy entire nations. Yet most people have never heard its real story. It's the few who have. They usually get the important parts wrong. What if I told you that the global debt crisis wasn't an accident, that it was engineered, that the same pattern has repeated almost identically across 7 decades in nearly 100 countries? Stay with me, because what you're about to learn will change how you see every economic crisis for the rest of your life. Let's go back to 1944. World War II is ending. The world's financial elite gather at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The official story. They're building a new system to prevent another Great Depression. But here's what they don't teach you in economics class. 2 institutions emerged from that meeting. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Their stated mission was noble rebuild war-torn Europe and stabilize global currencies. But the mechanics they built into these institutions contained something else entirely. A mechanism that would, within 30 years, give them unprecedented control over sovereign nations. The key figure you need to know is John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, and Harry Dexter White, representing the United States. They disagreed on almost everything except one crucial detail. Both wanted a system where international debt would flow through centralized institutions. What happened next wasn't immediate. It took time, patience, and a crisis that nobody saw coming. The 1970s brought that crisis. Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility in 1971. Oil prices quadrupled by 1973. Suddenly, oil-exporting nations had mountains of cash they needed to invest somewhere. Enter the Western banking system with a simple pitch. We'll take your petrodollars and lend them to developing countries at attractive interest rates. Everyone wins. Countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia lined up. Why? Because post-colonial nations desperately needed capital for infrastructure. And these loans seemed like the path to prosperity. Interest rates were low, around 6%. The future looked bright. But there was a clause in these loans that almost nobody paid attention to. The interest rates weren't fixed. They were variable, tied to rates set by central banks in London and New York. Remember this detail. It becomes critical in exactly 9 minutes. Throughout the 1970s, developing nations borrowed aggressively. Brazil borrowed $12 billion. Mexico, $25 billion. Argentina, Chile, the Philippines, the list goes on. Infrastructure projects launched. Highways, dams, power plants. The World Bank and IMF watched approvingly, even encouraging more lending. Their economists published papers showing how debt-to-GDP ratios were sustainable and manageable. By 1979, the total debt of developing nations had grown to over $400 billion, a number that would be over $2 trillion in today's money. But something was happening in the United States that would change everything. Paul Volcker became chair of the Federal Reserve in 1979 with one mission: crush inflation in America, no matter the cost. He raised interest rates. Not gradually, aggressively, from 11% to 20% in just 3 years. Now, remember those variable interest rate loans? Overnight, countries that borrowed at 6% were suddenly paying 16%, 18%, even 20% interest. Now, their debt payments tripled. Mexico was the first to break. In August 1982, the finance minister called the U.S. Treasury with a simple message: we can't pay. Within months, over 40 countries couldn't meet their debt obligations. The entire developing world was on the edge of financial collapse. Banks in New York and London faced catastrophic losses. They had lent money they couldn't recover. This should have been the end of the story. A global default, a reset. But instead, this is where the real machine revealed itself. The IMF stepped in with a solution: structural adjustment programs. Here's how it worked. The IMF would provide emergency loans to prevent default, but only if countries agreed to specific conditions. Cut government spending, privatize state assets, devalue currency, open markets to foreign investment, reduce subsidies on food and fuel. These weren't suggestions. They were requirements. Within 5 years, over 70 countries had accepted IMF structural adjustment programs. And here's the pattern you need to see. Every country that took these loans found themselves needing more loans. The debt never decreased. It only grew. By 1990, developing countries owed $1.3 trillion, triple what they owed in 1980, despite paying hundreds of billions in interest. The machine had perfected its cycle. Lend money, create crisis through policy changes beyond the borrower's control, then offer rescue loans with conditions that ensure permanent debt. You might be thinking, surely the international community fixed this. They tried. The Brady Plan in 1989 restructured some debt. The Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative in 1996 promised relief. The Millennium Debt Relief in 2005 canceled portions of the poorest nation's debts. But here's what actually happened. For every dollar of debt canceled, new loans replaced it within 5 years. The World Bank and IMF now hold over $300 billion in outstanding loans. Private creditors hold another $900 billion. And the conditions? They never went away. They just got rebranded as good governance requirements and transparency frameworks. Now, let me show you why this matters right now. In 2020, when COVID hit, the IMF approved $108 billion in emergency loans to 85 countries. By 2023, 60% of low-income countries were either in debt distress or at high risk of it. Sri Lanka collapsed in 2022. Ghana defaulted in 2023. Pakistan is on the edge. Zambia, Lebanon, Suriname, the list grows monthly. But here's the shocking part. The same pattern is now appearing in developed nations. Greece in 2010 took an IMF program. Ireland, Portugal, Cyprus. These weren't developing countries. These were European Union members. And the conditions: cut pensions, privatize assets, reduce public services. The machine doesn't discriminate anymore. Consider this. Global debt now stands at $307 trillion to 356% of global GDP. Government debt alone is $92 trillion. Interest payments consume 20 to 30% of government revenues in dozens of countries. The United States pays over $600 billion annually, just on interest, more than the defense budget. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is 264%. Italy's is 144%. We're not watching developing countries fall into a debt trap anymore. We're watching the entire global system become the trap. So what are the 3 critical things you need to understand? First, debt isn't created by accident, it's created by design. The system requires ever-increasing debt to function, because debt is how control is maintained. Second, the next crisis won't look like 1982 or 2008. It will be bigger, because the debt is bigger. And there's no institution large enough to bail out the entire system when sovereign nations begin defaulting simultaneously. Third, this isn't about economics anymore, it's about sovereignty. When your government pays more in interest than it does on education or healthcare, who's really making decisions about your country's future? Here's the warning. We're in the late stages of the longest debt cycle in human history. Every previous cycle ended in either massive inflation, widespread default, or wore off in all 3. The question isn't whether this system is sustainable. The math already tells us it's not. The question is, what happens when it breaks? If this video changed how you see the world economy, share it with someone who needs to understand what's really happening. Subscribe because we're going deeper into the systems that control our world, systems that rely on you, not understanding them. And leave a comment. Do you think countries can escape this debt machine, or is it already too late? The clock is ticking. The debt is growing. See you in the next one.